What if the person sworn to uphold the law was hiding the darkest secret of all? A respected correctional officer, a forbidden affair behind bars, and a murder so brutal it shook the entire prison system. This wasn't just a crime, it was a desperate attempt to erase a truth that could destroy everything. But the most shocking part wasn't the murder itself, it was what happened after. A story of power, fear, and deception. Of a man who controlled the fate of inmates, but couldn't control his own. A secret so dangerous he was willing to kill to keep it buried. But no matter how carefully he tried to cover it up, the walls were always watching. And so was justice. Welcome to Crime Chronicles, where we uncover the darkest secrets behind the most shocking crimes. If you think you've seen it all, this case will make you question everything. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of a crime that proves the truth always comes to light, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it.
Desmond Tate was everything a correctional officer was supposed to be, at least on paper. At 40 years old, he carried himself with the discipline of a former soldier, a man who had served in the military before trading in his camouflage for a badge. His reputation at Claiborne Correctional Facility was built on respect, control, and fear. He ran the prison with an iron grip, ensuring that inmates followed the rules and officers stayed in line. His fellow guards saw him as a model officer, someone who never let his emotions get in the way of duty. No favoritism. No bending the rules. No weakness. Outside the prison walls, Desmond played the role of the perfect family man. He had been married for 15 years to his devoted wife, Latasha, and together, they raised 2 children in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. He was a deacon at his church, a man who spoke about discipline, morality, and the importance of family values. To everyone who knew him, he was a man of order and integrity. But behind the uniform, behind the sermons, behind the carefully built image, Desmond Tate was hiding a truth he couldn't face. Claiborne Correctional Facility wasn't just his workplace, it was his hunting ground. For years, whispers floated through the prison halls about Officer Tate and the way he treated certain inmates differently. His watchful eyes lingered too long. His presence in certain areas of the prison seemed too convenient. Some inmates swore they had seen him slipping into cells late at night, but no one dared speak too loudly. Because Desmond Tate wasn't just feared, he was untouchable. He had built a fortress around his secret, convincing himself that no one would ever know. That he was always in control. But what happens when the enforcer becomes the one breaking the rules? What happens when the one who punishes criminals becomes the very thing he condemns? Desmond Tate thought he had mastered the art of deception. But secrets, especially the deadly ones, always find their way to the surface. In the world of Claiborne Correctional Facility, power was everything, and Rico Valentine knew exactly how to wield it. At 29 years old, Rico had a charm that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't like the other inmates, he walked through the prison halls with a swagger that defied the very nature of his confinement. He wasn't scared. He wasn't ashamed. And he refused to be broken. Unlike most men locked away behind Claiborne's steel bars, Rico was openly gay, a fact that made him both a target and a mystery. In a place where pride could get you killed, he refused to shrink into the background. He carried himself with the same confidence and charisma that had made him a legend in the streets. Before prison, Rico lived fast, money, parties, and influence flowed through his hands like water. He had been arrested on drug-related charges, but even behind bars, he never lost his edge. He had a reputation. If you needed something, a favor, protection, a secret kept, Rico could make it happen. The guards hated him for it, but most of them played along. They knew that Rico had connections, both inside and outside the prison walls. And then there was Desmond Tate. The first time Desmond saw Rico, he felt it immediately, the tension, the disgust, the undeniable pull. Desmond despised Rico, or at least, that's what he told himself. To Desmond, Rico was everything he stood against. Loud. Shameless. Unapologetically himself. Desmond believed in control, in order, in discipline, and yet, with Rico, there was none of that. At first, Desmond made it his personal mission to break him. He pushed him harder than any other inmate. Extra cell searches. Random shakedowns. Unprovoked hostility. Rico took it all with a smirk, as if he already knew what Desmond was trying to hide. Then, something changed. The tension shifted. The disgust turned into curiosity. The hatred felt more like obsession. Desmond found himself watching Rico too closely. Following his every move. Lingering in places where he knew he could catch a glimpse of him. And Rico noticed. One night, everything changed. It started with a moment too long. A routine patrol turned into a whispered conversation. A challenge. A dare. Then came the secret meetings, the stolen moments in the shadows. Desmond tried to tell himself it was nothing. A slip. A mistake. A lapse in judgment. But it wasn't. It was something more, something neither of them could deny. The law enforcer was now entangled in the very thing he condemned most. And Rico? He knew too much. Desmond Tate had spent his entire life preaching discipline, power, and self-control. But in that prison, behind those walls, in the dark corners where no cameras could see, he had become everything he once feared. And the deeper he fell into Rico's world, the harder it became to keep his secret buried. It began as nothing more than routine. A search. A pat-down. A moment that should have meant nothing. But for Desmond Tate, that moment was the beginning of his downfall. The first time he felt Rico's body under his hands, he told himself it was just another job. Another inmate. Another duty. But something shifted, something he wasn't ready to face. He should have looked away faster. He should have forgotten the way Rico smirked at him, like he knew a secret Desmond refused to admit. But he couldn't. Every interaction after that felt different. The next time Desmond searched Rico's cell, his hands lingered just a second too long. It was barely noticeable. Just a flicker of hesitation. But Rico caught it. And that's when the game began. Rico had a way of getting under people's skin, but with Desmond, it was different. He saw through him. "You got a problem with me, Officer Tate?" Rico had asked one day, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Desmond like a challenge. Desmond had clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. "No. Just doing my job." Rico chuckled. That knowing, dangerous chuckle. "Nah, you got a problem with yourself." That was the first time Desmond felt the real weight of fear, not fear of Rico, not fear of what he might say, but fear of how right he was. He tightened control after that. He tried to avoid Rico, but prison was a small world, and fate had other plans. One night, during a routine lockdown, everything changed. Desmond was making his rounds when he heard muffled voices coming from Rico's cell. A conversation that should have been silent after lights out. Frustrated, he stormed in. "Lights out means lights out, Valentine." Rico was lying on his cot, one arm behind his head, that same infuriating smirk on his lips. "Relax, officer. Just talking to myself." Desmond stepped closer. Too close. And that's when it happened. Rico reached up, not touching him, not breaking the rules, just hovering. So close, Desmond could feel the heat of his skin. A test. A taunt. A moment that felt like it lasted forever. Desmond should have stepped back. He didn't. Instead, he stood there, breathing heavy, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. "I don't scare easy," Rico whispered. "You. I think you're terrified." Desmond snapped. Grabbed Rico by the collar, yanked him up, anger, frustration, confusion all boiling over. Rico didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He just stared. And then he smiled. That moment, Desmond knew he was lost. What followed wasn't immediate. It was slow, calculated, forbidden. At first, it was late-night cell checks that lasted longer than necessary. Glances that held too much weight. Then, whispers in the empty corridors. A brush of hands in passing. A stolen moment in the dark. Desmond fought it. Told himself it was nothing. But Rico knew better. He pushed the limits. Teased. Dared Desmond to take the next step. And eventually, he did. It was supposed to be a routine check. A moment that should have come and gone like every other night. But this night was different. The prison was quieter than usual. Most of the inmates were asleep, the halls dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Desmond Tate should have been finishing his rounds, should have been anywhere else but standing outside Rico Valentine's cell, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat. Rico was waiting. He always was. Seated on his cot, arms draped lazily over his knees, he didn't say a word when Desmond entered. He didn't have to. The silence between them stretched thick with unspoken tension. Desmond took a step closer. His boots scuffed against the concrete, the only sound in the small space. He told himself he was in control. That this was just another interaction, another inmate. But Rico's eyes, they burned into him, sharp, knowing. You ever get tired of pretending? Rico's voice was low, taunting, daring. Desmond's jaw clenched. He wanted to walk away. He should have. But he didn't. He reached for Rico, grabbing the front of his jumpsuit, yanking him up with too much force, too much emotion. Rico let him. A breath. A pause. A moment where the world outside that cell didn't exist. Then, without thinking, without logic or restraint, Desmond's lips crashed against Rico's. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Messy. A release of years of denial and frustration. Rico responded immediately, his hands gripping Desmond's uniform, pulling him in, matching his hunger. For the first time in his life, Desmond wasn't the one in control. And he liked it. That night was the first. But it wasn't the last. At first, they thought they were careful. Late nights. Empty hallways. Dark corners. But secrets don't stay hidden in prison. Not for long. It started small. Side glances from inmates. A smirk from a fellow officer. Conversations that went silent when Desmond walked in. Then came the direct comments. Yo, Tate, you been getting real close with Valentine. You got a favorite in here, officer. Desmond ignored them at first. Brushed them off as inmates stirring trouble. But deep down, he knew. People were watching. People were talking. One night, another officer, Sergeant Willis, pulled him aside. You need to be careful, Tate. The warden's been hearing things. Hearing what? Desmond wanted to ask. But he already knew the answer. Fear settled in. A fear he hadn't felt before. Not fear of getting caught, fear of what it meant if the rumors were true. Paranoia crept in. Desmond started avoiding Rico. Cut off the late nights, stopped the stolen touches, ignored the tension that never really went away. But it wasn't enough. One morning, after waking up drenched in sweat with swollen glands and aching joints, Desmond felt the first wave of panic. He convinced himself it was stress. Maybe the guilt was finally eating him alive. But then the fatigue worsened. The headaches. The lingering flu-like symptoms. And then came the weight loss. People noticed. Even his wife. You're not yourself, Desmond. Maybe you should see a doctor. The words hit harder than he expected. He had no choice. He had to get tested. At the Claiborne Correctional Medical Unit, Desmond sat in the cold, sterile room, his heart pounding in his chest. The nurse barely looked at him as she prepped the needle. Routine screening, Officer Tate. Just need a blood sample. Routine. That's what he told himself. The test was called the fourth-generation HIV test, one of the most advanced, able to detect both HIV antibodies and antigens in the blood, even in the early stages of infection. A tiny vial of blood. That's all it took. And then the wait began. 3 days later, the results were in. HIV, positive. His stomach dropped. His vision blurred. His world, everything he built, everything he believed about himself, shattered in an instant. He barely heard the doctor's voice explaining treatment options, viral loads, CD4 counts. None of it mattered. Because in Desmond's mind, there was only one person to blame. Rico Valentine. Desmond Tate's secret had finally caught up to him. The moment he realized he was infected, the weight of his own actions came crashing down on him. The shame, the guilt, the fear, everything he had tried to bury for so long now had a name, HIV. The virus was no longer just a diagnosis. It was a ticking time bomb, and Desmond knew exactly who to blame. It was Rico Valentine who had turned Desmond's life into a living nightmare. Desmond had been so sure that his secret would remain buried, that his affair with Rico, his forbidden attraction, would stay hidden in the shadows. But now, the reality was impossible to escape. And as he sat in his car that night, the anger bubbling inside of him, a dark thought took root: he has to die. Rico had done this to him. It was because of him that his whole world was about to unravel. Desmond couldn't face the shame of his family, his co-workers, the church, and most importantly, he couldn't face himself. The infection, Rico was the only one who could have given it to him, and Desmond knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy everything he had built. The plan was simple. And like everything else in Desmond's life, it had to be clean. The way he would execute it had to be flawless. A murder was never the goal. But in the heat of his rage, it became the only solution. He found out Rico would be working a night shift, alone in his cell. Desmond had spent the entire day pacing, rehearsing what he would do. His mind kept playing out the same horrific scenario, but the deeper he dug into his thoughts, the clearer it became: no one will ever know. At 10:15 p.m., Desmond's shift began. He walked through the halls of Claiborne Correctional Facility like he had done 1,000 times before. His uniform was spotless, his gun holstered at his side, and his mind was sharp. But underneath the routine, there was a darkness bubbling just below the surface. Desmond knew this night would be different. He made his way to Rico's cell. The lights had dimmed, and the prison was quiet except for the sounds of muffled voices from distant cells. Rico was sitting on his cot, staring at the wall as if he already knew what was coming. Desmond didn't hesitate. He approached the bars, watching as Rico looked up and flashed that familiar smirk. "Officer Tate," Rico said, his voice dripping with that same cocky confidence that always drove Desmond mad. Desmond said nothing in return. Instead, he unlocked the door and stepped inside the cell. The door shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Rico stood up, the playful smirk never leaving his face. "What is this, Tate? You here to finish what we started?" He took a step closer to Desmond, testing him as usual, the tension thick between them. Desmond's hands shook, but he gripped the gun firmly. "This is the only way," he told himself. His heart was racing. He couldn't go back. There was no other choice. "You've ruined me, Rico," Desmond spat, his voice shaking with anger. "I'm not the one who should be ashamed. You are. You infected me. You made me do things I never should have done." Rico's face shifted, the cocky grin falling for a moment. Desmond could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, realization that something wasn't right. But it was too late for him. Desmond had made his decision. "You don't understand," Desmond continued, his words coming faster now, driven by desperation. I had everything, my family, my career, my dignity. All of it. And you destroyed it. Rico's voice softened, a hint of sympathy in his eyes. Desmond. You didn't have to, but Desmond cut him off. I have nothing left, Rico. Nothing but this. And with that, Desmond drew his gun. The crack of the shot rang through the cell, and Rico collapsed onto the floor, his body jerking as the bullet tore through his chest. Blood pooled around him in an instant. Desmond stood frozen for a moment, staring at what he had done. His hands were still shaking, the gun heavy in his grip. Rico gasped, his eyes wide with shock, but the life quickly drained from him. He tried to speak, but the words never left his mouth. Desmond stood over him, watching the life slip away. In the silence that followed, Desmond knew there was no turning back. He hadn't just killed an inmate, he had destroyed a part of himself. The anger had clouded his judgment, and now there was no way to undo the damage. But as Desmond stood there, watching Rico's blood soak into the concrete floor, another thought began to settle in. This wasn't just about the affair or the HIV. This was about Desmond's need for control. The man who once prided himself on being above reproach, now just another man with blood on his hands. He quickly wiped the gun with a cloth, making sure there was no trace of his fingerprints. He stepped out of the cell and locked the door behind him. The deed was done. Desmond Tate had just committed murder, and for what? To protect his secret. To erase his guilt. But as the hours ticked on and the weight of the crime settled heavily on him, Desmond knew one thing for sure, he would never escape what he had done. No matter how carefully he tried to cover it up, the truth had a way of coming to light. And now, the truth about Desmond Tate, the perfect correctional officer, the devoted family man, was more dangerous than ever. Desmond Tate's version of events seemed airtight at first. When he reported the murder, he claimed that he had responded to a routine situation in the cell. Rico Valentine had become agitated and violent, prompting Desmond to act in self-defense. The story was predictable, officer doing his duty, inmate escalating to violence, and a necessary response to preserve order. To most, it seemed plausible. Desmond had been a model correctional officer for over a decade. He was known for his stoic demeanor, a man of authority who would never make an impulsive decision. His account checked out, and the prison's initial internal review cleared him. There were no signs of foul play in the security logs, no immediate red flags in his actions. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The inmates were the first to whisper. They had seen the tension between Desmond and Rico long before the night of the murder. It wasn't just the usual prison animosity. No, this was personal. They saw the glances, the exchanged words, the anger that always bubbled under the surface when Desmond and Rico shared the same space. The rumors were nothing new. In a prison, there was always talk. But this time, the whispers were louder, more insistent. One inmate, Charles "Chucky" Martin, a seasoned criminal with a knack for staying in the loop, spoke up. Chucky had been in the cell block that night, and while the guards were busy with their usual routines, he'd caught a glimpse of Desmond's confrontation with Rico. Chucky's story was more direct. He told detectives that he had heard raised voices from the adjacent cells before the shot rang out. The tone of the argument wasn't defensive, it wasn't about an inmate attacking an officer. Chucky said Desmond had been talking to Rico, practically pleading with him. Chucky overheard a few words, "You don't get to ruin me, Rico," and "You've taken everything from me." It was enough to raise eyebrows. Then came the security footage, or rather, the lack of it. Desmond had claimed that the situation unfolded quickly, that he had reacted instinctively. Yet, the security cameras in the hallway, directly outside Rico's cell, had gone dark for several minutes. This wasn't a simple glitch, it was a clear, intentional tampering. The footage was absent for the exact window of time when the shooting took place. Desmond had made sure the evidence didn't exist. But the prison's oversight team had started to connect the dots, and the missing footage was the first major crack in Desmond's facade. Detective Janelle Harper, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator from Internal Affairs, was called in to review the case. She wasn't easily swayed by the official narrative, and she had heard the rumors circulating within the prison. Harper had a reputation for exposing corruption, and her instinct told her that something was off about Desmond's story. She was determined to find the truth, no matter how far down the rabbit hole she had to go. Harper immediately noted the inconsistencies. Desmond had been too composed in his initial statement, too quick to cover every angle. His reaction didn't align with someone who had just witnessed an inmate's violent outburst. Desmond's history with Rico Valentine also didn't match the typical relationship between an officer and an inmate. It was far too personal, too charged. As she dug deeper into Desmond's life, Harper uncovered more layers of deception. She discovered a troubling pattern of behavior. Desmond had been spending an unusually high amount of time with Rico in the months leading up to the murder. The two men had shared moments that bordered on inappropriate, far too much familiarity for a correctional officer and a prisoner. There were reports of private conversations in hidden corners of the facility, long stares exchanged in the break room, and private messages passed between them under the radar. Then came the bombshell. A few weeks before his death, Rico Valentine had undergone a routine medical test. His HIV status had been checked, and the results had come back negative. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Desmond's rage over being infected was misplaced. Rico hadn't given him the virus. Desmond had either been infected by someone else or had been lying to himself about the timeline. The fact that Rico was clean contradicted Desmond's entire motivation for murder. Desmond hadn't killed Rico to cover up his own exposure, he had killed him to silence the threat of being exposed. Harper's investigation uncovered that Desmond had been battling his own demons long before that night. His affair with Rico had been more than just a sexual entanglement, it had been a reckless attempt to fill a void in his life. Desmond, the proud officer, the upstanding man, had let his desires spiral out of control, and when Rico threatened to reveal their secret, Desmond decided that he couldn't let that happen. But the truth was beginning to surface. Desmond hadn't just killed an inmate, he had killed an innocent man who had never intended to harm him. Rico had been nothing more than a scapegoat for Desmond's own shame and guilt. Desmond's story had already begun to unravel, and as Harper dug deeper, it became clear that the consequences of his actions would be far greater than anyone could have predicted. The evidence was stacking up against him, his lies, his manipulation, and the truth about what really happened that night were all coming to light. The investigation was far from over, but Desmond Tate's days of hiding in the shadows were numbered. The truth was falling apart, piece by piece, and it wouldn't be long before Desmond was forced to face the consequences of his deadly choices. Desmond Tate's arrest sent shockwaves through the media. The once revered correctional officer, the man who had walked through prison halls with the air of authority, now found himself shackled and paraded in front of the cameras, his world crumbling around him. News outlets pounced on the story, splashing his face across newspapers and flashing his name in bold letters across television screens. The public couldn't get enough of the scandal, the powerful prison officer brought down by the very system he once upheld. At home, Desmond's life unraveled even further. His wife, Latasha, who had stayed by his side through the earlier tensions, could no longer tolerate the weight of the lies, the deception, and the truth about his affair with Rico Valentine. She packed her bags and walked out of their home, her heart shattered by the man she thought she knew. Desmond had always been distant, but now he was a stranger, a man whose secrets were too dark to overlook. His children, once proud of their father's career and accomplishments, turned their backs on him. They couldn't fathom how the man who had raised them, who had set an example of discipline and respect, had devolved into someone capable of murder. Desmond's oldest son, Marcus, gave a tearful interview on local television, expressing his disgust and disbelief. "I never thought my dad could do something like this. He was supposed to protect people, not hurt them. And then there were his colleagues, the men and women he had worked alongside for years. The very same people who had praised him, respected him, now couldn't bear to look at him. Desmond had always been the golden child of the department, the model officer. But now, his colleagues turned their backs on him, refusing to even acknowledge his presence in court. The respect he had once commanded in the prison was now completely gone. He was a pariah, not just to the inmates but to the very system he had once served. The trial began with a heavy atmosphere, an unspoken tension in the courtroom that hung over every proceeding. Desmond's defense team, still clinging to the idea that Rico had been violent and deserving of his fate, tried to paint Desmond as a man pushed to his breaking point. They argued that the officer had acted in self-defense, that the prisoner had instigated the confrontation. But the evidence didn't support their claims. Detective Janelle Harper's testimony was crucial. She recounted her investigation in vivid detail, painting a picture of a calculated man who had used his power to manipulate the truth. The missing security footage, the questionable relationship between Desmond and Rico, the bombshell revelation of Rico's clean HIV status, each detail chipped away at Desmond's defense. Harper's words cut through the courtroom, leaving little doubt about the officer's guilt. The prosecution was unrelenting. They brought forth the key witnesses, those who had heard Desmond's words in the prison halls, those who had seen him in heated arguments with Rico. Chucky's testimony was damning, detailing the tense confrontations between the two men and describing how Desmond had threatened Rico in private. The defense had no answer for the testimony, and no counter for the mounting evidence. The emotional weight of the case, the betrayal of trust, the murder of an innocent man. These things were too much to ignore. When the jury deliberated, it took less than a day to reach a verdict. The evidence was clear, the motive was understood, and the truth had become undeniable. The jury returned with their decision: first-degree murder. Desmond Tate had killed Rico Valentine in cold blood, and there was no question that he would face the consequences. The judge, a stern figure with years of experience, didn't mince words as he handed down the sentence. Life in prison. No parole. No chance at redemption. Desmond's fate was sealed. As the gavel came down, Desmond sat motionless, his face betraying no emotion. There were no tears, no remorse in his eyes, just the cold, hard realization of what he had done. The once proud officer was now nothing more than a criminal, reduced to the same status as the very inmates he had once controlled. The ultimate irony of Desmond's sentence was impossible to ignore. The man who had been responsible for maintaining order within the prison system, the one who had been the ultimate authority figure, was now reduced to just another inmate. He would face the same brutality, the same violence, the same struggles as those he had once held in his grasp. His power had evaporated, his role in the system gone. In the prison, Desmond would be stripped of his uniform, his rank, his privileges. He would no longer be an officer. The man who once controlled others was now controlled. His days of holding sway over the inmates were over. In fact, he would likely find himself at the mercy of those he had once overseen. The irony was thick, as every day he would face the harsh realities of the very system he had manipulated. As Desmond was escorted out of the courtroom, the silence was deafening. The world around him had changed, and all he had left was a life behind bars. The betrayal he had committed against Rico, his family, and the entire justice system had finally caught up with him. There was no escaping it now. Desmond Tate would pay for his actions, just like every other criminal who had ever walked through the prison doors he had once guarded. But unlike the inmates he had once held in control, Desmond had no power to manipulate the system. He was at its mercy now. And as he was led to the holding cells, Desmond Tate knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. Desmond spent his life hiding who he really was. He chose violence over truth, hatred over acceptance, and in the end, it destroyed him. Rico didn't deserve to die. But Desmond couldn't let the world see who he really was. How far will people go to protect a lie? Do you think Desmond was a victim of his own self-hatred, Or was he simply a murderer trying to cover his tracks? What would have happened if he had just accepted the truth?